So you're preparing for an interview by going to LeetCode, solving problems on HackerRank, and then when you attend an interview, the coding challenge, the interviewer asks you the same question that you solved on LeetCode the night before. Now here's a question for you. Do you tell the interviewer that you already know this question and the answer, or do you not? The thing is, there are both advantages and disadvantages of both telling and not telling. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to tell you what those advantages and disadvantages are. And I'm also going to tell you my thoughts. And by the end of the video, I'm going to tell you the specific thing you need to tell to the interviewer to maximize your chances of success when you're faced with this kind of a situation. So it's fairly common to practice your coding for coding interviews by going to websites like LeetCode, HackerRank, TopCoder, CodeChef. There's a lot of them. And people tend to do this. It's not a surprise, right? You know that you need to solve these kind of problems because that's what gets asked in an interview. Now, the thing is, these kind of websites are not just interview prep. They're also interviewer prep, okay? The interviewer is also going through those websites to gather questions to ask candidates in an interview. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not going to touch that. It's a long debate and I don't want to get into that here. But the fact of the matter is people do it, okay? So when you attend a coding challenge, it's very likely that the interviewer has picked a problem from LeetCode or CodeChef or HackerRank, and they're going to ask you that problem. Now, the question is, what do you do when you're faced with a coding challenge, right? A coding interview, and the interviewer asks you a question that you already know? Do you pretend like you don't know and come up with the answer on the spot? Or do you tell them that you know? Well, there are advantages and disadvantages for both approaches, okay? For both telling and not telling. So let's look at what the advantages and disadvantages are, because it's not really very obvious, okay? So you can say, well, I'm not going to tell them, but there are disadvantages to that too, okay? The short answer is, my recommendation is you don't tell them, okay? You don't tell them that you know the answer, okay? And here's why. Now, let's look at the pros and cons of both approaches, okay? So let's say you tell them, right? You're faced with a coding challenge and you know the answer to it. So let's say you said, hey, I already know the answer. I have already solved this problem, okay? What happens if you say this? Well, the first advantage is that it's an honest thing to do, right? You're being honest, you're being truthful. So, well, that's an advantage of saying it. You're doing the honest thing. And also, you might get honesty points. The interviewer might be impressed that you're like, hey, this is a person who could have just silently solved the problem, but he or she is telling me that they know the problem already. He's an honest person or she's an honest person, right? You get bonus points. You get to impress the interviewer and you get extra points for yourself, okay? So this is different from actually being the honest thing to do. You do the honest thing to do irrespective of whether you get points for it or not, but getting points is another advantage. Okay, so now what's the disadvantage of saying this? Let's say you tell them that you know the problem. What's the disadvantage? Well, the first disadvantage is you might just have the interviewer pick a different problem. It's like the interviewer might go, oh, you know this? Well, here's another one. And that might be a little difficult. You might not know the answer to that, or you might not solve it as well as you had solved the other problem, right, which you already knew. The other disadvantage, if the interviewer does not move to a different problem, right? To say, okay, that's fine if you know it, let's continue with it. Now, what ends up happening is by acknowledging that you know the problem, the interviewer is going to expect you to do better than they would have if you hadn't admitted it. Okay, so if I were to give somebody a problem and then they say like they've solved this problem before, I expect them to nail it. Okay, because they know the problem, they better do a good job, right? So any mistakes that you made, if you acknowledge you know the problem and then you're trying to solve it, any mistakes that you made is going to count against you worse than if you hadn't admitted it, which makes sense, right? You're expected to do better for a problem that you know. And then the other disadvantage, and this is something that doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen sometimes, is these interviewers are doing their job and they leave their job to take an interview. Okay, so they have their own commitments, they have their own deliverables. They have a packed day and they're leaving that to attend interviews because that's one of the other things that the company asks them to do. So they don't do a lot of preparation. They might have just done some basic preparation. They might have like a go-to question that they ask all interviewers Now, by telling them that you know the problem, you might be compelling them to find something else. It's like, yeah, man, I didn't prepare for this. This was the only question I had planned to ask. So they might be compelled to say, oh, now I need to find something else. And this might throw the interviewer off their game. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to make the interviewer uncomfortable in any way. So acknowledging it might throw the interviewer off, might make the situation a little bit tricky to deal with. The interviewer might feel uncomfortable, and you don't want to risk the discomfort that the interviewer faces to reflect on their feedback. Again, an ideal interviewer, it wouldn't affect them, right? They are going to be impartial. They're going to be very objective in how they're going to assess you, but not all interviewers are ideal. And finally, this is, I think, a little unfair. And this is actually like, when do you get into a situation where you get asked a question that you already know? You increase the chances of getting into a situation by practicing more, right? The more you LeetCode, the more you do HackerRank stuff, the more are your chances of being asked a question that you already know. So if you tell them this, you're basically being penalized for all the hard work that you've put in, for all the preparation that you've actually done. So that's a disadvantage, right? Imagine you've spent a lot of time solving all these problems, and the interviewer asks you a problem that you already know, you tell them, and then they move on to something else. Well, you're actually being penalized for all the hard work that you did, okay? That's a big disadvantage in my opinion. Okay, so let's say you don't tell them. Looks like there are a lot of disadvantages for telling. So why don't you not tell them at all, right? You know the problem, and the interviewer asks you this. You don't tell them you're just going to directly go and solve the problem and possibly ace the response. What are the advantages and disadvantages of those? Well, if you don't tell them, what's the advantage? First of all, there's no moral qualms here, okay? You don't have to tell them, so you're not doing anything wrong. The interviewer didn't ask you if you know what the problem is or not. They just gave you the problem. They want you to solve it. So you don't have a responsibility to tell them that you know. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is you can actually ace the interview. You can nail that question. Since you know it, you can actually do a really, really good job of answering that question. Okay, that's the advantage. Now, what's the disadvantage? Well, believe it or not, there are disadvantages to not telling them as well. All right, so what's the first disadvantage? The interviewer might find out anyway. You're answering a question that you already know. You might have your thought process, the way you tackle the question will give away the fact that you know the problem, okay? The reason that happens is your thought process might not be of exploration, right? So when you get a problem that you're trying to solve, what do? You explore a bunch of different options, right? You don't know what the solution is. You explore an option and you're like, oh, this is not good. You explore some other option and say, that's not good, and so on, right? You try a few things and see what works. It's very unlikely that when you know the answer, that you're going to do the same thing. You're going to directly go to the result because you know that's how you solve the problem, okay? So your thought process is going to give away the fact that you know anyway. And then the shortcuts that you take in order to get to the end result, because you know where the end result is, might work against you. Because the thing about asking these coding challenges in an interview is the interviewer is actually examining how you think. Okay, they're going to examine what is the approach you take to get to a solution. So the fact that you know the solution is going to result in you taking certain shortcuts and not exploring a few things. And that might have the interviewer go, hey, this person didn't actually explore this option. He directly went to the solution. So they're going to take one of two conclusions, right? They're either going to say, well, this person obviously knows the answer, or they're going to say this person is being careless. They didn't explore all these other options. They just picked one, and maybe they're lucky they happen to end up with the result, okay? So the idea is, if the purpose of a coding challenge in an interview is to see how well you think, to see what are the different avenues of exploration that you're going to go to, well, having the answer is going to be to your detriment there. You're not going to be exploring all those things. You're not going to be thinking a way a new program is usually thought of. You're going to directly go to the solution. So the interviewer is either going to assume that you know the answer already, or they're going to think, okay, this is a careless person who does not think all the way through, but just happened to be lucky and they got the solution. Okay, so there are disadvantages to knowing what the solution is and not telling them as well. Okay, so what do you do? Like, how do you get around this? There are both positives and negatives. Well, here are my thoughts. And again, I told you the positives and negatives so that you can decide on your own. You don't have to follow what I think, but I'm going to give you an advice anyway. Okay, so first of all, the coding interview is about the approach you take. Okay, it is not about the solution. I've told this to many people before. It is never about getting the answer. It is never about solving the problem. It is always about the approach you take, the way you think. Okay, so it's the thinking process. It is how you talk about your thinking process. It's not just writing the solution on the whiteboard. Okay, it is about how you tell the interviewer what you're thinking about and why you made certain decisions. It's also about how you handle edge cases. It's also about how you test your code. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in addition to actually coming up with the solution, actually coming up with the answer. These are, in my opinion, more important than coming up with the answer itself. Okay, that's the first thought. Second thought, when you are preparing for an interview, how many LeetCode problems do you typically solve? I don't know, it depends on the person, of course, but typically there is way too many LeetCode problems, way too many HackerRank problems. And when you're faced with a question that you already know, the situation is more likely to be something like this. The problem is familiar to you. You know that you've solved the problem before, but the answer is not really like a ready reckoner for you, right? You can't just spit out the answer because you've memorized it, because there are way too many problems, right? At best, what you're having in that situation is a familiarity with the problem. Okay, so this is my thought number 2. So because of these two things, my opinion to this whole problem is that it really doesn't matter whether you know the solution or not. Okay, because A, it's about more than the solution, and B, even if you have a familiarity, you might probably not have memorized the solution, right? You still have to spend that time and effort to get to the solution, or at best what you have is familiarity with the problem and the solution. Okay, so my recommendation is to not tell them. Okay, it really doesn't matter, but since you don't really know 100%, you're not compelled to tell them that you know. All right, so you're not going to tell them, but then you have certain disadvantages, right? We looked at the disadvantages of not telling them you know the problem. First, the interviewer might find out anyway, and then it might affect your thought process, and that might work against you. Now, how do you solve these disadvantages? Well, I'm going to tell you the thing to say when you encounter this situation, right? So when you're given a problem that you know, here's something that I would recommend you say, okay? You acknowledge familiarity, because again, at best, that's probably what you have, okay? It's not like you tackled one problem the day before the interview and it's the same problem that you get in the interview. That's not the case. It's probably one of the 50 challenges that you've tackled. So at best, you are familiar with the problem. So you say, well, hey, I am familiar with this thing. Let me give it a shot. Okay, so here's the exact thing that I would recommend you say. Okay, you say this problem sounds familiar to me. Let me talk through my thought process of how I'd solve this. You notice here, you say one sentence to acknowledge the familiarity so that you are kind of having this insurance policy for if you take certain shortcuts and the interviewer is like, hey, this guy's going to the answer way too quick. Well, this sentence, this acknowledgement is your insurance policy. You say, this problem sounds familiar to me. But then immediately you switch to solving the problem. You say, let me talk through my thought process of how I'd solve this and then jump into the solution. Okay. By doing this, you acknowledge, but you don't make it a big deal. You immediately move on to solving the problem itself. Okay. If you do this, you are going to leverage the benefits of your hard work and knowing what the problem is, but then you also let the interviewer know that you're not kind of starting from a clean slate. So any shortcuts you take will be attributed to the familiarity that you have with the problem and with your preparation that you've done ahead of time. Okay, but in spite of this, even if you do this, what I'd recommend you do is have a script about how you're going to solve the problem. Okay, then this is something you do for all coding challenges, right? Any coding challenge you have, you need to have a certain set of steps that you're going to follow when you're asked a coding problem. For example, the first thing you're going to do is ask further clarifying questions, right? Ask them about corner cases, ask them about things which are not very clear. So even if you're familiar with the problem, you still ask those questions, because again, you don't want to assume, right? The problem might be a little different from what you're familiar with. You don't want to fall into that trap as well. So make sure you really understand what the problem is and not kind of fit it into one of the problems that you already know. And then when you're answering when you're providing a solution, it's important to also explain the why. And this is true whether you know the problem or not. But even if you know the problem, explaining the why is going to make you stand out and not have your familiarity be to your disadvantage, right? You're solving a problem, taking a particular approach, you tell them why you're taking the particular approach, right? You explain to them your thought process, and that's what helps. And this is actually something that I do in all of my coding challenge videos that I have on this channel, right? When I talk about a solution, I explain to you the why. So go check out those coding challenge solutions, and you'll kind of get a sense for how you explain what your solution is. So I hope this video was helpful. Go check out this playlist to look at some of the LeetCode and HackerRank coding challenge problems and solutions that I've already explained, so you kind of get a sense for how you would approach them in an interview.